The spreadsheet blurred before her eyes, but she didn't dare blink too long. In Raven Cavalcante's office, hesitation was weakness, and weakness was fatal. Silence pressed against the walls like a living thing, broken only by the faint hum of the intercom that could erupt at any moment with his voice, sharp, precise, demanding. She had learned to anticipate him, to breathe in rhythm with his pauses, to prepare answers before questions were asked. That was survival. Raven Cavalcante was not a man who needed to raise his voice. He commanded through stillness, through the way his gaze cut across a room like a blade. Executives flinched when he looked at them. Contracts bent under his scrutiny, and even the air seemed to shift when he entered. 34 years old, but already a legend whispered in boardrooms and back alleys alike. His empire was built on silence, on fear, on the kind of control that made men confess crimes before he accused them. Serafina Ashford had been his assistant for 23 months and 14 days. She counted everyone, because each day survived was proof of her competence. She noticed everything: discrepancies in shipping reports, clauses buried in contracts. The exact moment Raven's tone sharpened from cold professionalism to Arctic fury. That was why she was still here. Others had failed. Others had been dismissed with a single word. She remained because she anticipated him. The intercom crackled. "Miss Ashford." His voice carried that dangerous quietness that made her spine straighten instantly. She answered with practiced neutrality, the same tone she used to confirm dentist appointments. He questioned the chocolate clause in the Meridian contract, and she explained calmly, efficiently, reminding him she had already prepared a memo weeks ago. Silence followed. She had learned to find it almost meditative. Then a single word: fine. Grudging approval. Her desk phone rang. An outside line. Cillian, the antique shop owner, panicked about his grandmother's birthday and the family's relentless pressure. He needed a fake girlfriend. She should have said no. Her Saturdays were sacred. But Cillian had once saved her from eviction, had once donated quietly to her literacy charity. She owed him, and so she agreed. The gala was Saturday evening. The Cavalcante Gala. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. She told herself it was manageable. She would stand beside Cillian, smile appropriately, and monitor the gala logistics simultaneously. Multitasking at its finest. Raven barely noticed her beyond her function. He would not care. She believed that until the moment came. Saturday arrived wrapped in autumn chill. The Grand Meridian glittered with white roses, gold candlelight, champagne fountains worth more than her salary. She wore a deep burgundy dress, modest but elegant, hair swept into a low twist, gold studs in her ears. Invisible, professional, exactly how she preferred to operate. Cillian appeared, nervous but handsome, offering his arm. She accepted, reminding him of the rules. Hand, arm, nothing else. They had been dating 2 months. They met over a first edition Austen. Keep the story simple. The family swarmed. Names blurred. Questions about marriage, children, antiques. She smiled, deflected, kept one eye on the orchestra, the chandeliers, the catering schedule. She corrected 3 disasters in 5 minutes, then returned to Cillian's side. His grandmother embraced Victoria Moretti, Raven's estranged mother. Of course, the universe was determined to complicate everything. Victoria's eyes were calculating, her smile warm but venomous. "Ashford," she said, recognizing the name. "You must know my son." Serafina met her gaze steadily. "I work for Cavalcante Holdings." Understanding flickered across Victoria's face. "How interesting." The orchestra swelled. The ballroom doors opened. Raven Cavalcante entered like winter itself had taken human form. Black tuxedo, tailored with surgical precision, dark hair immaculate, expression carved from granite. Conversations dimmed. No one dared stare directly, but his presence altered the atmospheric pressure. He moved through the crowd with deliberate economy, shaking hands with donors, speaking exactly the right words for exactly the right time. Then his gaze swept the room and stopped. On her hand resting in Cillian's. 3 full seconds. His expression did not change. His posture did not shift, but something in the air crystallized. He moved, not toward the host table, not toward the donors. Toward her. 5 strides, measured, precise. Conversations trailed off. Even the orchestra faltered. He stopped at their table, eyes glacial, voice carrying that dangerous quietness. "Miss Ashford." A word. It was not a request. Cillian's hand tightened protectively. She extracted her own, rose on unsteady legs, and followed Raven toward the balcony. The October wind cut through her dress, raising goosebumps. He stood at the railing, hands braced against stone, as if restraining himself from something. She steadied her voice. "Mr. Cavalcante, if this is about the chocolate." He turned, eyes raw, dangerous. "Since when do you date?" Each word was deliberate, enunciated like a blade. She blinked, pulse jumping. She had never seen him like this. Not anger, not fury, something more volatile, something that made silence heavier than any threat. And in that silence, she realized the most dangerous contract of all wasn't written on paper. It was the one she had just signed with her presence. The ballroom was buzzing with chatter, but underneath the laughter and clinking glasses, there was a tension that couldn't be ignored. The chandeliers threw golden light across polished marble floors. The orchestra played something elegant, and waiters moved quickly with trays of champagne. On the surface, it looked perfect. But perfection was fragile, and Raven Cavalcante had no patience for cracks. Serafina Ashford knew this better than anyone. She had spent weeks making sure every detail of the gala was flawless. She had memorized the guest list, double-checked the catering, and even timed the orchestra set list. But tonight wasn't just about logistics. Tonight, she was standing beside Cillian, playing the role of his girlfriend. It was supposed to be harmless. A favor. A cover story for his family. Nothing more. Then Raven walked in. He didn't need to announce himself. The room shifted the moment he entered. Conversations dipped, the music seemed quieter, and people instinctively moved out of his way. He was dressed in a black tuxedo that fit like it had been made for him alone, his expression unreadable, his presence heavy. He shook hands with donors, nodded at allies, every move calculated. And then his eyes found her. Serafina felt it immediately. His gaze locked on her hand, resting in Cillian's. 3 seconds stretched into something unbearable. Raven's face didn't change, but the air around him did. He moved, not toward the host table, not toward the donors waiting for his attention, but toward her. Each step was deliberate, each stride cutting through the crowd. Conversations faltered, violins slipped off key. By the time he reached the table, the silence was thick. "Miss Ashford." A word. His voice was low, steady, but it carried the kind of weight that made people confess things they hadn't even done. It wasn't a request. Serafina pulled her hand free from Cillian's and stood. Her legs were steady, but her pulse raced. She followed Raven out of the ballroom, through the doors, onto the balcony. The October wind was sharp, biting through her dress, raising goosebumps. Raven stood at the railing, his hands pressed against the stone, his posture rigid, like he was holding something back. She tried to keep her voice calm, professional. "Mr. Cavalcante, if this is about the event coordination." He turned, and for the first time, she saw something different in his eyes. Not anger, not the cold fury she had seen him use to dismantle executives. Something raw, something dangerous. His words were slow, deliberate. "Since would you date?" The question hit harder than any accusation. Serafina blinked, her mind racing. It was supposed to be simple. A favor for a friend. A harmless cover story. But Raven's tone made it clear. This wasn't simple. This was personal. She met his gaze, steady, refusing to flinch. "It's just business, Mr. Cavalcante. Nothing more." But his silence lingered. Heavy, unyielding. And in that silence, Serafina realized the most dangerous contract of the night wasn't written on paper. It was the one she had just signed with her presence, with her hand in another's, with the unspoken truth that Raven Cavalcante, the man who ruled through silence, had frozen with jealousy. The gala continued behind them. Music swelled, glasses clinked, conversations resumed. But out on the balcony, the world had narrowed to two people, a question and a silence that promised consequences. The balcony air was sharp, the kind of cold that made every breath feel heavier. Raven didn't move, didn't speak, but his silence was louder than the orchestra playing inside. Serafina stood a few feet away, her arms crossed against the chill, waiting for him to say something more. He didn't. He just stared, and that stare was enough to make her pulse race. She had seen him dismantle executives with a single look. She had watched him turn boardrooms into graveyards of careers. But this was different. His questions still hung between them. Since when do you date? And it wasn't about contracts or logistics. It was about her. She tried to steady herself, reminding her mind of the facts. She was here as Cillian's cover, nothing more. She was still Raven's assistant, still the one who kept his empire running smoothly. But the way he looked at her now made it clear. He didn't see her as invisible anymore. Inside, the gala carried on. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, donors whispered about deals. But Serafina knew Raven's mother was at table 17, watching everything. Victoria Moretti had made her presence known, and her eyes had already measured Serafina like a piece on a chessboard. That alone was dangerous. But Raven's silence was worse. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, steady. You think this is business? She swallowed, keeping her tone calm. It is. A favor for a friend. Nothing more. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He turned back to the railing, staring out at the city lights. The skyline glittered, but his expression was unreadable. She knew better than to press him. Silence was his weapon, and right now, he was using it on her. When they returned inside, the atmosphere shifted again. Raven walked ahead, his presence cutting through the crowd. People moved aside instinctively, conversations dipping as he passed. Serafina followed, her mind already racing through the next tasks, ensuring the catering stayed on schedule, checking the lighting cues, monitoring the guest flow. But she couldn't shake the weight of his question. At table 17, Victoria smiled like a queen. She leaned toward Elena Moretti, whispering in Italian, her eyes flicking toward Raven and then back to Serafina. It was clear she had noticed everything. Cillian, the gala was supposed to be about contracts, about securing alliances, about showing strength. But now, personal complications were bleeding into business. Raven's jealousy was a crack in his armor, and cracks were dangerous. Rivals noticed cracks. Family noticed cracks. And Serafina knew that tonight, everything was shifting. She kept her smile in place, kept her posture professional, but inside, she was bracing herself. Because Raven Cavalcante's silence wasn't just about contracts anymore. It was about her. And that meant the consequences would be far more complicated than anything she had planned for. Victoria Moretti's smile was the kind that could unsettle even the most confident guest. She sat at table 17, her diamonds catching the light, her posture regal, her eyes sharp. Every word she spoke carried weight, and every glance was calculated. Serafina could feel her watching, measuring, waiting. Raven's mother had returned after 20 years of silence, and she had chosen tonight, his night, to make her move. The donors around her laughed politely, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Elena Moretti leaned close, whispering in Italian, her tone affectionate but urgent. Victoria's gaze flicked toward Raven, then back to Serafina, as if she had already decided that the assistant was part of the game. Serafina kept her smile steady, her posture professional, but inside she was bracing herself. Raven moved through the crowd with his usual precision, but something was different. His attention was divided. He shook hands, exchanged short sentences, but his eyes kept drifting back to Serafina. Each glance was sharp, deliberate, and it unsettled her more than any outburst could have. Raven did not allow distractions, yet tonight, he was distracted. The business of the gala pressed on. Contracts were discussed in hushed tones. Rival families circled like predators. Donors sought reassurance that Cavalcante Holdings was as strong as ever. But Raven's silence carried a new edge. His jealousy was bleeding into the negotiations, and Serafina could see it. He dismissed one donor too quickly, cut short another conversation, his patience thinner than usual. Rivals noticed. They always noticed. Victoria rose from her seat, her movements graceful, her smile unwavering. She crossed the room with the confidence of someone who had once ruled it. And when she reached Raven, she greeted him as if 20 years had not passed. "My son," she said warmly, though her eyes were cold. The crowd hushed, sensing the significance. Raven's jaw tightened, but he did not refuse her. He never refused in public. Serafina watched from across the room, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had dreaded. Victoria's presence was not just personal, it was strategic. She had chosen the gala to reappear, knowing Raven could not ignore her in front of donors and rivals. And now, with his jealousy already cracking his control, her timing was perfect. The orchestra played on, but the music felt distant. Raven stood face to face with the mother who had abandoned him, the assistant who had betrayed his silence, and the crowd that expected him to remain unshaken. Serafina knew the balance of power was shifting. Tonight was no longer about contracts or champagne. It was about family, betrayal, and the cracks in Raven's armor. She kept her smile in place, kept her posture professional, but inside, she was preparing for the fallout. Because Raven Cavalcante's silence was no longer just about business. It was about her, and that meant the consequences would reach far beyond the gala. Victoria Moretti moved with the kind of grace that made people step aside without realizing it. Her silver dress shimmered under the chandeliers, her diamonds catching every flicker of light. She crossed the ballroom slowly, deliberately, her smile warm but her eyes sharp. When she reached Serafina, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "So," Victoria said, her voice smooth, carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of those nearby. "You're the one my son trusts." Serafina kept her posture straight, her tone calm. "I work for Cavalcante Holdings. I make sure things run as they should." Victoria tilted her head, studying her like a puzzle piece she hadn't expected to find. "And yet tonight, you're not just working. You're sitting at my table. You're holding hands with a man my son doesn't know. That makes you interesting." The words were polite, but the weight behind them was heavy. Serafina felt the eyes of the family on her, felt the donors nearby, pretending not to listen. She kept her smile steady. "It's a favor, nothing more." Victoria's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing more? My dear, in this world, nothing is ever just a favor. Everything has a cost. Everything has meaning. And my son," she paused, letting the silence stretch, "it doesn't like surprises." Serafina's pulse quickened, but she refused to flinch. "I know Mr. Cavalcante well enough to anticipate his needs. Tonight is no different." Victoria leaned closer, her voice dropping, her tone sharper. "Then anticipate this. He will not forgive you for making him feel something he cannot control. Jealousy is weakness, and weakness is dangerous. You've already shown him both." The orchestra swelled, covering the tension for a moment, but Serafina felt the words sink in. Victoria wasn't just testing her. She was warning her, and she was doing it in public where Raven could see, where rivals could notice, where every move mattered. Serafina held her ground, her voice steady. "I don't play games, Mrs. Moretti. I do my job. That's all." Victoria's smile returned, softer now, almost approving. "We'll see. Tonight, you're part of the story whether you want to be or not." She turned away, gliding back toward her seat, leaving Serafina standing in the middle of the ballroom with the weight of her words pressing down. Raven's gaze found her again from across the room, cold and unreadable, but sharper than before. The gala was no longer about contracts or donors. It was about control, and Serafina had just been pulled into the center of it. Raven's reaction was subtle, but in a room like this, subtlety carried more weight than shouting. He didn't storm across the floor or raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence was sharper than any blade, and everyone nearby felt it. He stood with donors, his posture perfect, his words clipped, but his eyes kept drifting back to table 17. Each glance was quick, precise but unmistakable. The men he spoke to noticed. They shifted uncomfortably, sensing his attention wasn't fully on them. Rivals noticed too. They saw the crack, the distraction, and in their world, distraction meant opportunity. Victoria Moretti leaned back in her chair, her smile calm, her diamonds glittering. She had made her move, and now she was watching the fallout. She had spoken to Serafina directly, planting seeds of doubt, and now she was waiting to see how Raven would respond. Serafina felt the weight of it all pressing down. She kept her expression professional, her posture steady, but inside she was bracing herself. Raven's jealousy wasn't just personal, it was bleeding into the business of the night. He dismissed one donor too quickly, cut short another conversation, his patience thinner than usual. The ripple effect spread across the gala. Marcus, Raven's head of security, noticed too. He stood near the edge of the room, his eyes scanning constantly, but his focus kept flicking toward Raven. He knew his boss well enough to recognize when something was off. And tonight, something was off. The orchestra played on, the champagne flowed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Guests whispered, sensing tension they couldn't name. Rivals leaned closer, testing the waters, probing for weakness. And Raven, the man who ruled through silence, was showing cracks. Serafina knew what this meant. In their world, weakness was dangerous. Jealousy was dangerous. And tonight, Raven's silence was no longer just about contracts or control. It was about her. She kept her smile in place, kept her voice calm when spoken to, but inside, she was preparing for the inevitable. Because Raven Cavalcante's reaction wasn't finished. His silence was building toward something, and when it broke, the consequences would reach far beyond the gala. Rivals were quick to sense the shift. They had been circling all evening, waiting for a moment when Raven's control slipped, and now they saw it. His silence was heavier than usual, his patience thinner, his attention divided. That was all they needed. Marco Bellini, head of a rival family, leaned forward at his table, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard. Strange, isn't it? Cavalcante looks distracted tonight. Not like him at all. His companion smirked, whispering about weakness, about opportunity. Victoria Moretti watched with satisfaction. She had planted the seed, and now the room was watering it. Her confrontation with Serafina had been deliberate, public enough to draw eyes, sharp enough to leave a mark. She knew Raven would see, and she knew rivals would exploit it. That was her plan. Serafina felt the pressure building. She kept her smile steady, her posture professional, but inside she was bracing herself. She had become the center of attention, not by choice, but by circumstance. Victoria had dragged her into the spotlight, and now every glance, every whisper, every smirk was directed her way. Raven noticed. His eyes cut across the room, landing on Bellini, then on Victoria, then back on Serafina. He didn't speak, but his silence was sharp, his stare enough to make Bellini shift uncomfortably. Still, the damage was done. The rivals had seen the crack, and they would not forget it. Victoria rose again, her movements graceful, her smile calm. She approached Serafina once more, this time with a tone that carried warmth for the crowd, but steel underneath. "You must understand, dear," she said, her hand brushing Serafina's arm lightly. "In this world, appearances matter more than truth. And tonight, you've given my son an appearance he cannot control." The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. Serafina had become a symbol of Raven's distraction, and Victoria was making sure everyone saw it. Serafina held her ground, her voice steady. "I do my job. That hasn't changed." Victoria's smile widened. "Perhaps. But tonight, you are more than his assistant. You are his weakness, and that makes you very important." The orchestra swelled, covering the tension for a moment, but the damage lingered. Rivals whispered, donors hesitated, and Raven's silence grew heavier. Serafina knew the night was far from over. Victoria had forced her into the spotlight, and Raven's jealousy had cracked his armor. The consequences were only beginning. Raven's silence finally broke, but not in the way anyone expected. He didn't lash out, didn't raise his voice, didn't let emotions spill. Instead, he chose precision. He stepped away from the donors mid-sentence, leaving them startled, and crossed the room toward table 17. The crowd shifted instinctively, conversations dipping, eyes following. Victoria Moretti rose to meet him, her smile calm, her diamonds glittering. She expected control, expected her son to remain bound by etiquette. But Raven's presence was heavier than the music, sharper than the whispers. He stopped in front of her, his voice low but carrying across the room. "You return after 20 years, he said, each word deliberate. "And you choose tonight to test me." The room hushed. Rivals leaned closer, sensing the confrontation. Donors froze, unsure whether to stay or retreat. Victoria's smile didn't falter. "I came to see strength," she replied smoothly. "Instead, I see distraction." Her eyes flicked toward Serafina, making sure everyone noticed. Raven's gaze followed, landing on his assistant. The silence stretched, heavy, dangerous. Then he turned back to his mother. "Distraction is what you want them to believe. But weakness is not mine. It belongs to those who mistake silence for surrender." The words cut through the room like a blade. Bellini shifted uncomfortably, his smirk fading. Donors exchanged glances, reassured by the steel in Raven's tone. Victoria's smile thinned, but she didn't retreat. She had forced him to speak publicly, and that alone was a victory. Serafina stood still, her expression calm, but inside she felt the weight of his words. He hadn't denied her importance. He hadn't dismissed the accusation. He had turned it into a weapon, using it to reassert control. Yet the way his eyes lingered on her made it clear. The jealousy remained, buried beneath the surface, waiting. The orchestra resumed, the crowd exhaled, but the atmosphere had changed. Raven had spoken, and his silence was broken. The rivals had been warned, the donors reassured, but the family tension was far from resolved. Victoria returned to her seat, her smile smaller now, her eyes sharper. She had tested him, and though he had held his ground, she had found the crack she wanted. Serafina knew the night wasn't over. Raven's public response had shifted the power dynamics, but the consequences of his jealousy were still unfolding. And she was standing at the center of it all. The negotiations began to unravel the moment Raven's silence shifted. Rivals had been waiting for cracks, and now they pressed harder, testing the edges of his control. Marco Bellini moved first, sliding into conversation with a group of donors near the orchestra. His tone was casual, but his words carried weight. "Cavalcante Holdings is strong, yes," he said, swirling his glass. "But strength means nothing if the man at the top is distracted." The donors exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shaken. Serafina caught the words as she passed, her ears trained to pick up every whisper. She knew Raven had heard them too. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't respond. He let the silence hang, heavy and dangerous. Yet silence alone wouldn't be enough tonight. The rivals were bold, and Victoria had given them reason to be. She stepped closer, her voice calm, professional but firm. "Mr. Bellini," she said, her tone carrying just enough to draw attention, "contracts don't collapse because of distractions. They collapse because of weak foundations. Cavalcante Holdings doesn't build on weakness." The donors straightened, reassured by her confidence. Bellini smirked, but the edge of his smile faltered. He hadn't expected the assistant to speak, hadn't expected her to step into the arena. Raven's gaze flicked toward her, sharp, unreadable, but lingering. Victoria watched from her table, her smile thin. She had wanted Serafina exposed, and now she was. But instead of crumbling, Serafina was holding her ground. That made her dangerous in a different way. The negotiations continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Rivals pressed harder, donors hesitated, and Raven's silence grew heavier. Serafina moved through the crowd, intercepting conversations, correcting misinformation, reminding donors of the contracts already secured. She was steady, professional, unshaken. And slowly, the ripple of doubt began to fade. Raven finally spoke, his voice low but carrying across the room. "Bellini," he said, each word deliberate, You mistake silence for weakness. That mistake will cost you. The room hushed. Bellini's smirk vanished. Donors leaned in, reassured by the steel in Raven's tone. Rivals shifted uncomfortably, realizing the line had been drawn. Serafina felt the weight of his words, felt the way his gaze lingered on her even as he spoke to Bellini. He had reasserted control, but the jealousy remained buried beneath the surface. And she knew it would not stay buried for long. The gala pressed on, the orchestra playing, the champagne flowing, but the negotiations had shifted. Raven had spoken, Serafina had stepped in, and the rivals had been warned. Yet Victoria's smile remained, calm and calculating. She had forced her son to reveal his hand, and she had seen the crack she wanted. Serafina kept her posture straight, her voice calm, but inside she was bracing herself. Tonight was far from over. The contracts were secure, the donors reassured, but the family tension and Raven's jealousy were still simmering. And she was standing at the center of it all. The gala reached its breaking point when Raven finally decided to act. He had let the whispers run their course, had let Victoria play her hand, had let Bellini smirk and prod. But Raven Cavalcante was not a man who allowed cracks to remain visible for long. He moved with deliberate calm, stepping into the center of the ballroom where the chandeliers threw golden light across polished marble. The orchestra faltered, sensing the shift, and conversations dipped into silence. Victoria's eyes followed him, her smile poised, her diamonds glittering. She had forced him to speak once already, and she expected him to remain bound by etiquette. But Raven's silence had sharpened into something else, something heavier, something dangerous. He raised his glass, his voice low but carrying across the room. Tonight was meant to show strength. Contracts secured, families united, rivals reminded of their place. And yet, some mistake silence for weakness. His gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Bellini, then on Victoria, then finally on Serafina. Let me be clear. Silence is not surrender. It is control, and control is mine. The words cut through the air, steady and precise. Donors straightened, reassured. Rivals shifted, their smirks fading. Victoria's smile thinned, but she did not retreat. She had wanted him to reveal himself, and he had. But the way his eyes lingered on Serafina told her everything she needed to know. Then Raven did something unexpected. He gestured towards Serafina, drawing her into the spotlight. This gala stands because of her. Every detail, every contract, every moment of order. She is not a distraction. She is the reason you are here tonight. The room hushed. Donors exchanged glances, surprised by the public acknowledgement. Rivals frowned, realizing Raven had turned the accusation into a weapon. Victoria's eyes narrowed, her smile fading completely. She had wanted to expose Serafina as weakness, but Raven had reframed her as strength. Serafina stood frozen, her heart pounding. She had never been named publicly, never been pulled into the center of Raven's empire like this. His words were meant to protect her, to shield her from the whispers, but they also bound her to him in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer invisible. She was part of the story. The orchestra resumed. The crowd exhaled, but the atmosphere had changed. Raven had spoken, and his silence was broken. The rivals had been warned, the donors reassured, but the family tension was far from resolved. Victoria returned to her seat, her expression cold, her eyes sharp. She had tested him, and though he had held his ground, she had seen the truth she wanted. Her son's control was not absolute. Serafina kept her posture straight, her voice calm when spoken to, but inside she was bracing herself. Tonight had shifted everything. Raven had defended her, had named her, had tied her to his empire in front of everyone. And that meant the consequences would reach far beyond the gala. The gala wound down, but the tension didn't fade. Guests began to leave, their laughter softer now, their conversations cautious. The orchestra played its final piece, the champagne glasses emptied, and the chandeliers dimmed slightly as the night drew to a close. Yet in the center of it all, Raven Cavalcante remained still, his silence heavier than ever. Victoria Moretti watched him from across the room, her smile gone, her eyes sharp. She had tested him, forced him to speak, and though he had defended himself, she had seen what she wanted. The way his gaze lingered on Serafina, the way his control had cracked. She rose gracefully, leaving the ballroom without another word, her diamonds catching the last flicker of light. Serafina stood near the edge of the room, her posture straight, her expression calm, but inside she was unsettled. Raven had named her publicly, had tied her to his empire in front of everyone. It was a shield, yes, but it was also a chain. She was no longer invisible. She was part of the story now, whether she wanted to be or not. Raven finally moved, crossing the room with deliberate steps. He stopped in front of her, his eyes unreadable, his voice low. "You did well tonight." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Approval from Raven was rare, and it was never given lightly. Serafina nodded, keeping her tone steady. "I did my job." His gaze lingered, sharp, searching, as if he wanted to say more, but refused. Then he turned away, leaving her standing in the quiet aftermath. The gala was over, but the consequences were only beginning. As the last guest departed and the staff began to clear the tables, Serafina realized the night had changed everything. Raven's jealousy had cracked his silence. Victoria had forced her into the spotlight, and the rivals had seen weakness they would not forget. The empire was still intact, but the balance of power had shifted. And in that shift, Serafina understood something she hadn't before. Raven Cavalcante's silence was no longer just about contracts or control. It was about her. And that meant the next move, whatever it was, would be far more dangerous than anything she had faced so far. The aftermath of the gala stretched into the following days like a shadow that refused to fade. On the surface, everything appeared orderly. Contracts signed, donors satisfied, rivals silenced. But beneath that polished exterior, cracks were spreading. Raven Cavalcante's silence had been broken, and once broken, silence never returned the same. Victoria Moretti's departure had been graceful, but her absence was louder than her presence. She had left without confrontation, without spectacle, but everyone knew she had achieved what she wanted. She had exposed her son's distraction, had forced him to reveal his hand, and had tied Serafina Ashford to his empire in front of the world. That was her victory, and it lingered like perfume long after she was gone. Rivals wasted no time. Marco Bellini began calling donors privately, reminding them of Raven's hesitation, of the way his gaze had lingered too long on his assistant. He spoke of cracks, of weakness, of opportunity. Others followed, whispering in corridors, testing the edges of alliances. They had seen something they had never seen before. Raven Cavalcante unsettled, and they would not forget it. Inside Cavalcante Holdings, the atmosphere shifted. Meetings were sharper, shorter, Raven's patience thinner. He dismissed executives with fewer words, cut through reports with colder precision. Yet Serafina noticed the difference. His silence was no longer the calm control she had learned to anticipate. It was heavier now, edged with something volatile. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried an undercurrent she couldn't ignore. She kept her routine steady, arriving early, organizing contracts, anticipating his needs, but the weight of the gala followed her. Every glance from Raven carried more meaning than before. Every silence between them stretched longer. He had named her publicly, had tied her to his empire, and now the consequences were unfolding. Victoria's influence spread quietly. She began sending letters to donors, subtle reminders of her legacy, hints of her return. She spoke of family, of tradition, of strength. And though Raven ignored them, Serafina knew the letters mattered. They were seeds, planted carefully, waiting to grow. The rivals pressed harder. Meetings with Bellini grew tense. Negotiations with Santoro stalled. Contracts with Ricci required more effort. Raven's silence was tested again and again, and Serafina found herself stepping in more often, smoothing conversations, correcting details, reminding donors of stability. She had become more than an assistant. She was now a shield, a voice, a presence that held the empire together when Raven's silence faltered. But the cost was clear. She was no longer invisible. Rivals watched her, donors questioned her, Victoria measured her. And Raven's gaze lingered too often, too long, sharper than before. His jealousy had cracked his silence, and now it was shaping his empire in ways no contract could control. The days after the gala were quiet on the surface, but beneath, everything was shifting. Raven's silence was different. Victoria's influence was spreading. Rivals were circling, and Serafina was standing at the center of it all, bound to an empire she had never intended to join, caught in a storm that was only beginning. The trap was set in a boardroom dressed up as diplomacy. The rivals had chosen a neutral hotel suite downtown, polished wood tables, crystal water glasses, and contracts stacked neatly in leather folders. On the surface, it looked like business. In reality, it was an ambush. Marco Bellini sat at the head of the table, his smile too wide, his tone too smooth. He spoke of cooperation, of shared ventures, of opportunities that would benefit both families. But every word was bait. He wanted Raven to falter, wanted the donors to hear hesitation, wanted the empire to look unstable. Raven sat opposite him, his silence heavy, his posture perfect. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, but Serafina could see the tension in his jaw. She had learned to read him, to anticipate the smallest shifts, and tonight, his silence carried something sharper. The gala had left its mark, and Bellini knew it. The rival leaned forward, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard by the assistants and advisors in the room. Of course, we all know Cavalcante Holdings is strong, but strength means nothing if the man at the top is distracted. Rumors spread quickly, you understand. His eyes flicked toward Serafina, deliberate, calculated. The words hung in the air, heavy, dangerous. Raven didn't respond. His silence was his weapon. But tonight, silence alone wasn't enough. The donors shifted uncomfortably. The advisors exchanged glances. Bellini's smirk widened. Serafina felt the weight of the moment pressing down. She had been dragged into the spotlight at the gala, and now she was being used as leverage in negotiations. She kept her voice calm, her tone professional, but firm. Rumors don't build contracts. Results do. Cavalcante Holdings delivers results. That's why you're here. The room stilled. Bellini's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't expected her to speak, hadn't expected her to step into the line of fire. Raven's gaze flicked toward her, sharp, unreadable, but lingering. Bellini recovered quickly, his smile returning. Ah, the assistant speaks. Impressive. But tell me, Miss Ashford, do you speak for him? Or do you speak for yourself? Serafina held her ground, her voice steady. I speak for the contracts, and the contracts speak for him. The donors straightened, reassured by her confidence. The advisors nodded, reminded of the stability they needed. Raven's silence remained, but now it was reinforced by her words. Bellini shifted in his seat, his smirk fading completely. The trap had been set, but Serafina had stepped into it and turned it back on him. Raven finally spoke, his voice low, deliberate. Bellini, you mistake distraction for weakness. That mistake will cost you. The words cut through the room, sharp and final. Bellini leaned back, his smile gone, his posture stiff. The donors exhaled, reassured. The advisors relaxed, tension easing. The trap had failed. Serafina sat still, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. She had stepped into the line of fire, had spoken when silence wasn't enough, and had held her ground. Raven's gaze lingered on her, sharper than before, but unreadable. He had let her speak, had let her shield the empire, and that meant something. The meeting ended with contracts signed, rivals silenced, and donors reassured. But the consequences lingered. Serafina was no longer just an assistant. She was part of the negotiations, part of the empire, part of Raven's silence. And that meant the storm was far from over. The days after the negotiation trap carried a new kind of tension. Rivals had failed to corner Raven, but they had succeeded in shifting the spotlight onto Serafina. She was no longer just the assistant who kept things running quietly in the background. She had spoken, she had shielded the empire, and now she was being watched. Donors began asking for her directly in meetings. wanting her reassurance alongside Raven's silence. Rivals tested her, probing for cracks, trying to see if she was truly strength or if she could be broken. And Victoria Moretti, ever calculating, sent subtle messages through intermediaries, reminding everyone that Serafina was Raven's weakness. Raven noticed. He noticed every glance, every whisper, every time Serafina was pulled into the center of the empire. His silence grew heavier, his patience thinner, his gaze sharper. He dismissed executives faster, cut through reports with colder precision. But when it came to her, his control faltered. He lingered too long, watched too closely, spoke too little. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Raven called her into his office. The room was dim, the city lights glowing against the glass. He stood at the window, his reflection sharp, his silence pressing. Serafina waited, steady, professional, though her pulse raced. Finally, he turned, his voice low. "They see you now. They will use you, and I cannot allow weakness." She met his gaze, calm but firm. "Then don't treat me as weakness. Treat me as strength." The words hung between them, heavier than any contract. Raven's silence lingered, his eyes locked on hers, sharp and searching. For the first time, she saw the fracture clearly. His jealousy had cracked his control, and now it was colliding with something deeper, something he had never allowed himself to admit. He stepped closer, his voice quieter, almost reluctant. "You change everything." Serafina held her ground, her voice steady. "Then let it change." The silence that followed was not surrender. It was the edge of something new, something dangerous, something Raven Cavalcante had never faced before. His empire was intact, but his silence was no longer just about contracts or control. It was about her. And that meant the confession he had been resisting was drawing closer, inevitable, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer hold it back. The confession came quietly, but it carried the weight of everything Raven had been holding back. It was late, the office empty, the city lights glowing against the glass. Serafina had finished organizing the contracts from the Bellini meeting, her hands steady even though her mind was racing. Raven stood at the window, his reflection sharp, his silence pressing. He had been watching her more closely since the gala, since the negotiation, since she had stepped into the line of fire. Tonight, that silence was different. He turned, his eyes locked on hers, his voice low but deliberate. "You change everything." Serafina held his gaze, calm but firm. "Then let it change." The silence stretched, heavier than any contract, sharper than any negotiation. Raven stepped closer, his words clipped, almost reluctant, as if admitting them cost him something. "I don't allow distractions. I don't allow weakness. But you," he paused, his jaw tightening, his eyes searching hers. "You are not weakness. You are the one thing I cannot ignore." Her breath caught, but she didn't flinch. "Raven," his voice dropped, quieter now but sharper. "I try to keep you invisible. I try to keep you out of this. But I can't. I see you. I want you. And that is the truth I cannot silence." The words hung between them, heavy, final. Raven Cavalcante, the man who ruled through silence, had confessed the one thing he could not control. Serafina stood still, her heart pounding, her voice steady. Then stopped fighting it. For the first time, Raven's silence was not a weapon. It was surrender. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his gaze unyielding. The empire was intact, the contract secure, but the storm inside him had broken. And in that moment, Serafina knew Raven's love was not soft, not gentle, not easy. It was sharp, deliberate, dangerous. But it was real. The confession had come, not with flowers or promises, but with silence breaking into truth. And that truth would change everything. The fallout from Raven's confession was immediate, though not spoken of openly. In their world, words carried consequences, and his admission had shifted the balance of power in ways neither of them could ignore. Rivals sensed something had changed. Bellini's whispers grew sharper, Santoro's meetings dragged longer, and Ricci's contracts came with hidden clauses. They weren't just testing Raven's silence anymore. They were testing Serafina. She had become part of the empire, and that made her a target. Victoria Moretti moved quietly, her influence spreading like smoke. She sent subtle messages to donors, reminding them of tradition, of family, of strength. But beneath the polished words was a clear strategy. Expose Serafina as Raven's weakness, force him to choose between empire and emotion. Inside Cavalcante Holdings, the atmosphere was different. Raven's silence was heavier, his patience thinner, but his gaze lingered on Serafina more often. He didn't speak of his confession again, but it hung between them in every meeting, every glance, every silence. She had become more than his assistant, more than his shield. She was the fracture in his control, and he knew it. Serafina kept her routine steady, contracts organized, meetings prepared, crises anticipated, but the weight of his words followed her. She had heard him admit what he could not silence, and now every interaction carried that truth. She was no longer invisible. She was part of him, part of the empire, part of the storm. The rivals pressed harder. Bellini arranged a dinner, inviting donors and allies, deliberately excluding Raven, but sending Serafina an invitation. It was a trap designed to test her loyalty, to see if she would stand alone or falter without Raven's presence. Raven noticed. His silence sharpened, his jaw tightened, his gaze unyielding. He didn't forbid her from going. He didn't speak at all, but his silence carried a warning, a weight, a truth she couldn't ignore. Serafina understood. The fallout from his confession wasn't just personal. It was political. It was strategic. It was dangerous. And she was standing at the center of it, bound to Raven's empire, bound to his silence, bound to his love. The store was only beginning. The dinner was staged like diplomacy, but every detail screamed trap. A private dining hall in Bellini's hotel, polished silverware, wine poured too generously, and donors seated strategically to watch. Marco Bellini sat at the head, his smile smooth, his tone dripping with false warmth. "Miss Ashford," he said, raising his glass. "It's rare to see you without Cavalcante at your side. Refreshing, isn't it? To speak freely, without silence weighing down the room." The donors chuckled politely, but Serafina felt the weight of every eye on her. She kept her posture straight, her voice calm. "Mr. Bellini, silence is not weight. It's control. And control is why Cavalcante Holdings stands where it does." Bellini's smirk faltered, but he pressed on. "Control, yes. But control slips when emotions interfere." Everyone saw it at the gala. Cavalcante distracted, his empire shaken. And you, his eyes narrowed, deliberate, you at the center of it. The words hung heavy. Donors leaned in, waiting for her response. Rivals smirked, sensing opportunity. Serafina steadied herself, her tone sharp but professional. Distraction is what you want them to believe. But contracts don't collapse because of rumors. They collapse because of weakness. And weakness is not ours. The room stilled. Donors exchanged glances, reassured. Rivals shifted, their smirks fading. Bellini leaned back, his smile gone, his posture stiff. He had expected her to falter, to crumble without Raven's presence. Instead, she had turned the trap back on him. But the danger wasn't over. Victoria Moretti's allies were present, watching closely, measuring Serafina's every word. They would report back, twisting her strength into ammunition. And Raven, though absent, would hear of this dinner, would know she had stood alone, would know she had been tested. When the dinner ended, donors left reassured, rivals unsettled, and Bellini silent. Serafina walked out steady, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. She had proven herself, had shown she was not weakness, had held the empire together without Raven's silence. Yet she knew the fallout was coming. Raven would confront her, his jealousy colliding with his recognition of her strength. Victoria would press harder, exploiting every crack. And the rivals would not stop. The storm was building, and Serafina was standing at the center of it, bound to Raven's empire, bound to his love, bound to the danger that came with both. Raven's reaction to the dinner was not delayed. The moment Serafina returned to Cavalcante Holdings, he was waiting. His office was dim, the city lights glowing against the glass, his posture rigid, his silence pressing. She entered calmly, her expression professional, though her pulse raced. She had faced Bellini alone, had turned the trap back on him, had shielded the Empire without Raven's presence. But she knew what was coming. Raven turned slowly, his eyes locked on hers, his voice low but sharp. "You went without me." Serafina kept her tone steady. "I was invited. Donors were present. If I hadn't gone, they would have seen hesitation. Weakness." His jaw tightened, his silence heavier. "You put yourself in their hands. You let them test you." She met his gaze, unflinching. "And I passed. The contracts are intact. The donors are reassured. Bellini is silent. That's what matters." Raven stepped closer, his voice clipped, deliberate. "You don't understand. They weren't testing contracts. They were testing you. Because they know what you are to me." The words hit harder than any accusation. Serafina's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "And what am I to you?" The silence stretched, sharp, dangerous. Raven's eyes narrowed, his control faltering. He had confessed once already, reluctantly, but tonight his jealousy collided with his recognition of her strength. He stepped closer, his voice low, almost raw. "You are the one thing they cannot touch, and the one thing I cannot lose." Her heart pounded, but her voice remained calm. "Then stop treating me like weakness. Let me stand beside you." Raven's silence broke, not with anger, but with truth. "You already do." The words carried weight, final and undeniable. His jealousy had sharpened into protectiveness. His confession deepened into recognition. Serafina was no longer invisible, no longer just his assistant. She was part of him, part of the Empire, part of the storm. And in that moment, she knew, Raven's love was not soft, not gentle, not easy. It was sharp, deliberate, dangerous. But it was real, and it was hers. The escalation began almost immediately after Raven's confession. Rivals, sensing the shift, moved faster, sharper, more deliberate. They had seen Serafina stand alone at Bellini's dinner, had seen her shield the Empire, and now they understood. She was no longer just an assistant. She was part of Raven. That made her both strength and target. Victoria Moretti pressed harder. She began hosting her own gatherings, inviting donors and allies, weaving subtle narratives about family, tradition, and legacy. In every whisper, Serafina's name appeared, always framed as Raven's weakness, always positioned as the crack in his control. Victoria wasn't just undermining contracts. She was undermining Raven's heart. The rivals followed suit. Santoro arranged meetings where Serafina was deliberately isolated, probing her for hesitation. Ricci sent contracts with hidden traps, knowing she would be the one to review them. Bellini spread rumors, twisting her strength into scandal, suggesting she had more influence than Raven himself. Inside Cavalcante Holdings, the atmosphere grew tense. Raven's silence was sharper, his patience thinner, his gaze heavier. He dismissed executives with fewer words, cut through reports with colder precision. But when it came to Serafina, his control faltered. He lingered too long, watched too closely, spoke too little. His confession had changed everything, and now the Empire was shifting around it. Serafina felt the weight of it all pressing down. She kept her routine steady, contracts organized, meetings prepared, crises anticipated, but every move carried more risk. She was no longer invisible. She was part of the Empire, part of Raven, part of the storm. And the storm was growing. The escalation reached its peak when Victoria made her boldest move yet. She arranged a public gathering, inviting donors, rivals, and allies, and announced her intention to restore the family legacy. Her words were smooth, her smile calm, but her meaning was clear. Raven's empire was hers to challenge, and Serafina was the lever she would use. Raven's silence broke that night, sharper than ever. He stood before the crowd, his voice low but deliberate. Legacy is not restored by whispers. It is built by strength, and strength is mine. His gaze swept the room, landing on Serafina, lingering, unyielding. And hers. The declaration stunned the crowd. Donors exchanged glances. Rivals shifted uneasily. Victoria's smile thinned. Raven had not only defended Serafina, he had claimed her publicly, irrevocably. The escalation had reached its climax. Raven's love was no longer hidden, no longer whispered, no longer confined to silence. It was sharp, deliberate, dangerous, and now undeniable. The aftermath of Raven's public declaration rippled through the empire like a shockwave. Donors were unsettled but intrigued. Rivals were furious. And Victoria Moretti was sharper than ever. By naming Serafina as strength, Raven had tied her fate to his empire in front of everyone. That meant every attack on him would now include her. Victoria moved first. She began whispering to allies that Raven's empire was no longer built on contracts and silence, but on emotion. She painted Serafina as a liability, a distraction, a fracture that would eventually collapse everything. Her words spread quickly, subtle but poisonous. The rivals followed. Bellini pushed harder in negotiations, deliberately baiting Serafina with questions meant to undermine her authority. Santoro arranged meetings where she was isolated, probing for hesitation. Ricci sent contracts with traps buried deep in the fine print, hoping she would miss them. They weren't just testing Raven anymore. They were testing her. Inside Cavalcante Holdings, the atmosphere grew tense. Raven's silence was sharper, his patience thinner, but his protectiveness over Serafina was undeniable. He lingered too long in meetings, watched her too closely, dismissed executives who questioned her role. His confession had changed everything, and now the empire was shifting around it. Serafina felt the weight pressing down. She had proven herself at Bellini's dinner, had stood beside Raven in public, but now every move carried more risk. She was no longer invisible. She was part of the empire, part of Raven, part of the storm. And the storm was growing. The fracture became clear one evening when Raven confronted her privately. His voice was low, deliberate, but edged with something raw. "They will come for you because of me. They will use you to break me. And I cannot allow that." Serafina met his gaze, calm but firm. "Then let me stand beside you. Don't shield me. Trust me." His silence lingered, heavy, dangerous. Then he spoke, sharper than ever. "I do trust you. That is why they fear you." The words carried weight, final and undeniable. Raven's love was no longer hidden, no longer whispered, no longer confined to silence. It was sharp, deliberate, dangerous, and now undeniable. But the empire was shifting. Victoria was pressing harder, rivals were circling, and Serafina was standing at the center of it all. The storm was only beginning, and love alone would not be enough to survive it. Victoria's turning point came with precision. She orchestrated a grand reception at one of the city's oldest estates, gilded halls filled with donors, rivals, and allies. It was not just a gathering, it was a declaration. She stood at the center, her voice smooth, her smile poised. "Legacy," she said, her tone carrying across the room, "is not built on contracts alone. It is built on family. And tonight, I remind you all that the Cavalcante legacy is mine to restore." The words were deliberate, sharp. Donors leaned in, rivals smirked, allies nodded. But beneath the polished speech was her true weapon, Serafina. Victoria's eyes flicked toward her, subtle but unmistakable. "Some would tie our empire to outsiders, to distractions. But legacy cannot be diluted. It must remain pure." The crowd murmured, the implication clear. Serafina was being painted as the fracture, the outsider, the weakness. Raven's silence broke instantly. He stepped forward, his presence heavier than the chandeliers above, his voice low but carrying. "Legacy is not purity. Legacy is strength, and strength is mine, and hers." His gaze locked on Serafina, unyielding, undeniable. The room stilled. Donors exchanged glances. Rivals shifted uneasily. Victoria's smile thinned. Raven had not only defended Serafina, he had claimed her again, publicly, irrevocably. But Victoria was prepared. She leaned forward, her tone sharper now. Then you admit it. You tie your empire to her. You make her your strength. And that means when she falls, you fall with her. The words cut deep, deliberate. The crowd murmured louder, the tension thick. Raven's jaw tightened, his silence pressing. But Serafina stepped forward before he could speak. Her voice was calm, steady, but sharp. Strength is not about who can be broken. It's about who cannot. And I will not. The declaration stunned the room. Donors straightened, reassured. Rivals faltered, unsettled. Victoria's smile faded completely. Serafina had not only defended herself, she had claimed her place beside Raven, publicly, irrevocably. The turning point had come. Raven's love was no longer hidden, no longer whispered, no longer confined to silence. It was sharp, deliberate, dangerous, and now undeniable. And Serafina had stepped into it fully, standing beside him, facing the storm together. The consequences of Raven's declaration unfolded like a storm. By tying Serafina to his empire publicly, he had shifted the battlefield. Every rival, every donor, every ally now saw her as part of his strength, and therefore part of his vulnerability. Victoria Moretti struck first. She began weaving sharper narratives, whispering to donors that Raven's empire was no longer built on contracts and silence, but on emotion. She painted Serafina as the fracture, the outsider, the distraction. Her words spread quickly, subtle but poisonous, and donors began hesitating, questioning whether Raven's control was slipping. The rivals followed. Bellini pressed harder in negotiations, baiting Serafina with questions meant to undermine her authority. Santoro arranged meetings where she was deliberately isolated, probing for hesitation. Ricci buried traps in contracts, hoping she would miss them. They weren't just testing Raven anymore. They were testing her. Inside Cavalcante Holdings, the atmosphere grew tense. Raven's silence was sharper, his patience thinner, but his protectiveness over Serafina was undeniable. He dismissed executives who questioned her role, cut through reports with colder precision. But when it came to her, his control faltered. His confession had changed everything, and now the empire was shifting around it. Serafina felt the weight pressing down. She had proven herself at Bellini's dinner, had stood beside Raven in public, but now every move carried more risk. She was no longer invisible. She was part of the empire, part of Raven, part of the storm. And the storm was growing. The fracture became clear one evening when Victoria made her boldest move yet. She arranged a private meeting with donors and allies, presenting documents that suggested Serafina had overstepped her role, implying she was making decisions beyond her authority. It was a calculated strike, designed to force Raven into a corner, defend Serafina again, or risk appearing weak. Raven's silence broke instantly. His voice was low, deliberate, but edged with steel. She does not overstep. She stands where I place her. And where I place her is beside me. The declaration stunned the room. Donors exchanged glances. Rivals faltered. Victoria's smile thinned. Raven had not only defended Serafina, he had claimed her again, more fiercely than before. Victoria's trap was elegant, cruel, and perfectly timed. She arranged a high-profile charity gala, inviting donors, rivals, and allies under the guise of philanthropy. The event was staged with precision, golden chandeliers, velvet drapes, and cameras discreetly positioned to capture every moment. At the height of the evening, she unveiled her strike. A series of documents were presented to the crowd, carefully curated to suggest that Serafina had overstepped her role. The papers implied she had signed contracts without Raven's approval, made decisions beyond her authority, and positioned herself as more than an assistant. The room buzzed instantly. Donors whispered, rivals smirked, allies exchanged uneasy glances. Victoria's voice carried smoothly above the murmurs. This is what happens when emotion clouds judgment. Legacy cannot be diluted by outsiders. Strength must remain pure. It was a direct attack, designed to force Raven into a corner. If he defended Serafina, he risked appearing weak, ruled by emotion. If he stayed silent, he risked losing her and the empire she had shielded. Raven's silence broke like steel. He stepped forward, his voice low but deliberate, cutting through the noise. She does not overstep. She stands where I place her, and where I place her is beside me. The declaration stunned the room. Donors froze, rivals faltered, Victoria's smile thinned. Raven had not only defended Serafina, he had claimed her publicly, irrevocably, in front of everyone. Serafina felt the weight of his words pressing down, but she did not flinch. She stepped forward, her voice calm, steady, sharp. Strength is not about who can be broken. It's about who cannot, and I will not. The crowd stilled. Donors straightened, reassured. Rivals shifted uneasily. Victoria's smile faded completely. Her trap had failed, not because Raven had shielded Serafina, but because Serafina had claimed her place beside him, openly, undeniably. The consequences, however, were clear. By tying her to his empire so fiercely, Raven had made her the center of every attack. And Serafina knew love and power were now inseparable, and survival meant facing both together. The aftermath of Victoria's trap was explosive. Raven's public defense of Serafina had silenced the room, but once the gala ended, the whispers spread faster than ever. Donors left divided, some reassured by Raven's strength, others unsettled by how openly he had tied his empire to her. Rivals regrouped, their smirks gone, but their strategies sharper. And Victoria, though her smile had faded, was already planning her next strike. Inside Cavalcante Holdings, the tension was palpable. Executives spoke in hushed tones, wary of questioning Serafina's role, but unsettled by her sudden prominence. Raven's silence was heavier than ever, his protectiveness undeniable. He dismissed anyone who doubted her, cut through reports with colder precision, and made it clear. Serafina was no longer just his assistant. She was his strength. Serafina felt the weight pressing down. She had stood beside Raven, claimed her place, and faced Victoria's trap head-on. But now, every move carried more risk. She was no longer invisible. She was part of the empire, part of Raven, part of the storm. And the storm was growing. Victoria's allies began spreading rumors, subtle, poisonous suggestions that Serafina was controlling Raven, that she was manipulating contracts, that she was steering the empire for her own gain. Rivals seized on the whispers, testing her in negotiations, probing for cracks. The empire was intact, but the foundation was shifting. One evening, Raven confronted her privately. His voice was low, deliberate, but edged with something raw. They will come for you because of me. They will use you to break me. And I cannot allow that. Serafina met his gaze, calm but firm. Then let me stand beside you. Don't shield me. Trust me. His silence lingered, sharp, dangerous. Then he spoke, his words clipped but final. I do trust you. That is why they fear you. The aftermath was clear. Raven's love was no longer hidden, no longer whispered, no longer confined to silence. It was sharp, deliberate, dangerous, and now undeniable. But Victoria's war was far from over, and the rivals were circling closer. The empire was shifting, and survival meant facing love and power together. Victoria's most dangerous move came like a blade hidden in silk. She arranged a high-stakes negotiation with international investors, presenting it as a chance to expand Cavalcante Holdings globally. But beneath the polished contracts and champagne flutes, the trap was clear. She intended to isolate Serafina, discredit her in front of the world, and force Raven into an impossible choice. The meeting began smoothly, investors seated around a long mahogany table. Victoria smiling with practiced grace. She spoke of legacy, of tradition, of strength, but then shifted the spotlight. Miss Ashford, she said, her tone sharp but polite, you've spoken boldly in defense of Cavalcante Holdings. Tell us, then, what authority do you truly hold? Are you here as assistant, or as something more? The question was poison, designed to corner Serafina. If she claimed authority, she would be accused of overstepping. If she denied it, she would be painted as weakness. The investors leaned in, waiting. Raven's silence was heavy, but Serafina stepped forward before he could speak. Her voice was calm, steady, sharp. I am here because strength is not measured by titles. It is measured by results. And Cavalcante Holdings delivers results because Raven Cavalcante leads it, and because I stand beside him. The room stilled. Investors exchanged glances, reassured by her confidence. Victoria's smile thinned, her trap faltering. But she pressed harder, her tone colder. Then you admit it. You tie yourself to him. You make yourself his strength. And that means when you fall, he falls with you. The words cut deep, deliberate. The investors murmured, tension thick. Raven's silence broke like steel. His voice was low, deliberate, final. She will not fall, because I will not let her. The declaration stunned the room. Investors straightened, rivals faltered, Victoria's composure cracked. Raven had not only defended Serafina, he had claimed her fiercely, irrevocably, in front of the world. The confrontation ended with contracts signed, investors reassured, and Victoria silent. But the consequences were clear. By tying Serafina to his empire so openly, Raven had made her the center of every attack. And Serafina knew love and power were now inseparable, and survival meant facing both together. But the consequences were clear. By tying her to his empire so openly, Raven had made her the center of every attack. And Serafina knew love and power were now inseparable, and survival meant facing both together. The resolution unfolded with the same sharp precision that had defined every move before it. Victoria's influence, once sprawling, began to fracture. Her whispers lost weight as donors saw contracts holding firm, negotiations closing smoothly, and Serafina standing unshaken beside Raven. Rivals, once eager to exploit cracks, found themselves silenced by her steady presence and Raven's unyielding defense. The empire, tested again and again, had not broken. Inside Cavalcante Holdings, the atmosphere shifted. Executives no longer questioned Serafina's role. They deferred to her, recognizing her as part of Raven's strength. Meetings ran smoother, contracts were signed faster, and donors spoke of stability instead of scandal. The storm that had threatened to consume them was finally calming. Victoria made one last attempt, a quiet letter sent to key allies, reminding them of legacy and purity. But the words fell flat. Raven's declaration had been too public, too fierce, too final. Serafina was no longer an outsider. She was part of the empire, part of Raven, part of the legacy itself. One evening, in the quiet of Raven's office, the city lights glowing against the glass, he broke his silence. Not with steel, but with truth. They tried to use you against me. They tried to make you weakness. But you are the reason I did not break. Serafina met his gaze, calm but steady. Then let us build it together. His silence lingered, but this time it was not distance. It was surrender. He stepped closer, his voice low, deliberate, final. Together, the storm had ended, not with collapse, but with transformation. Raven's silence had become love. Serafina's strength had become empire. And together, they had reshaped everything. The empire had weathered every storm. Victoria's whispers had fractured, rivals had faltered, and donors had finally accepted Serafina as part of Raven's strength. The contracts held, the negotiations closed, and the silence that had once been weapon now carried something deeper. One evening, in the quiet of Raven's office, the city lights glowing against the glass, he stood before her. His posture was rigid, his silence pressing, but his gaze was softer than she had ever seen. He stepped closer, his voice low, deliberate, final. "Miss Ashford," he said, each word sharp but edged with truth, "I have fought silence, fought distraction, fought weakness. But you are none of those things. You are the reason I did not break." Serafina held his gaze, calm but steady, then stopped fighting it. The silence lingered, heavy, dangerous, but this time it was not distance. It was surrender. Raven's jaw tightened, his eyes locked on hers, and at last, the words he had resisted broke free. "I love you, Miss Ashford." The storm ended in that moment, not with collapse, but with transformation. Raven's silence had become love. Seraphina's strength had become empire, and together they had reshaped everything.